that it's a good idea to start the conference with a quick overview about your career and your background. Your slides are already for the transition, already ready for the transition, okay?
Yeah, okay, good. I'll be just seeing like next slide, so to let you know when you need to move one by one slide down. Okay. Okay, excellent. So the first slide. So I'm Alexander Serenko from Lakehead University, Canada. It's only 2:30 p.m. here, so I have more time to do something useful. Well, my background was first in computer science. So I used to be one of those computer freaks who spent like 15 hours a day in front of a monitor. Otherwise, the day is wasted. Played lots of video games. At some point, I got sick and tired of doing that, and I went for an MBA. I did an MBA at McMaster University. This is when I met Nick Bontis, who is one of the founders of the field. And I started working with Nick Bontis, and I simply decided to stay for a PhD after. I did my PhD in MIS, Information Systems. What else? And I've been doing research in knowledge management for well over 10 years. And one of my major strengths in the field of KM and IC, it is scientometrics. Scientometrics is a science about science. So I'm simply looking at the development, the state, the impact, and the evolution of KM and IC as a scientific field. So what is the origin of the field? How it has been progressing? Where is it going? Productivity impacts, productivity and impact. So this is my area of expertise. The PowerPoint slides are available online. So if somebody is interested, please, you can just Google me by my first name and find the PowerPoint slides. It is very simple. So please go to the next slide. Yeah, so it's agenda. So first, I'll briefly talk about the evolution of KM and IC, because I heard that there are going to be a few practitioners in the room. So I think it may be a good idea for me to briefly cover the evolution of the field. And then I'll be talking about my findings, mostly based on my personal research, what I've done with Nick Bontis so far for the last 12 years. It's about the state of knowledge management and intellectual capital disciplines. Then I'll talk about the practical relevance and impact of research. And maybe I'll give you a few suggestions on how to promote research in your own country. So again, if you're interested in my PowerPoint slides, you can just go to my homepage, Google it, and you'll find them. Next, please. So that's a screenshot which shows my homepage, and the PowerPoint slides are right here, like in the middle. There is a link. So let's go. Let's talk about the evolution of the field. Next, please. Next slide. So KM and IC, those are probably the youngest scientific disciplines within the management domain. They've been around for maybe only 2 decades. However, we believe through our personal research that both KM and IC may be already called scientific disciplines because they do possess all the attributes of a scientific discipline. So first of all, we have journals, scientific journals in the domain. We have conferences, lots of them. I believe way too many. We don't need so many conferences. I would rather concentrate on the rigor of research than just on the number. But anyway, we have leading scholars. We have research centers. We have several research centers in KM in Canada only. We have networks of scholars. We have theories, and we have academic courses. Nick Bontis has been teaching a course on knowledge management at McMaster University since 2002. And I was one of the first students to take it. So next slide, please. So the evolution of the field. Both KM and IC have very deep historical roots, which unfortunately are usually forgotten by the KM researchers. So if you're new in the field, please go to those seminal works that I listed right here, read them and make use of them. The 18th century professional knowledge was mentioned first in the Dutch language, but fortunately we have Google Translator, so you may translate the entire paper into somehow English or Portuguese and read it. Intellectual capital, 1836, when Senior mentioned it, but didn't really define it well enough. Then we heard about the notion of resources, goodwill, tacit knowledge, Polanyi, everybody citing this paper. The paper by Kronfeld and Rock, 1958. This is based, to best of my knowledge, this is the first time intellectual capital was defined. So 1858, Kronfeld and Rock actually defined intellectual capital and said that IC is the reason, one of the major reasons how the stock price is formed. However, very interesting, to the best of my knowledge, this paper was written, published in a peer-reviewed journal. It has never been cited. No one has ever seen it. Nobody has ever read it. So when I found it, I was really, really surprised. It's one of the, there's a phenomenon when a paper was created, written, and totally, this knowledge was totally lost for the society, unfortunately. And then we heard about the stock of knowledge, the brain worker knowledge worker, Tobin-Skew ratio. Please go and read this paper. It's available online. Read the original one. IC, KM are not mentioned in this paper. And it's very interesting that people always refer to this paper. However, it is just, I see maybe simply just one of the reasons. And since 1975, this is when IC, intellectual capital, actually appeared in the literature, when the book, The Intellectual Capital of Michael Kalecki, was published. Then we got organizational learning, the resource-based view of the firm, and knowledge-based view of the firm. Next slide, please. Then, the 1970s, human resource accounting. This is a stream of research which appeared, and in 5-10 years, quickly disappeared. And the problem was that that researchers looked at the IC perspectives from the general accounting perspective. So they simply did not invent anything new. They tried to apply the old paradigm to the new paradigm, and it just all collapsed. We also got value-added statements in the 1970s to report on the overall value of the company. And again, it appeared and disappeared, but the reason for this disappearing was different. It was simply abuse, because companies started abusing all those value-added statements. They were trying to present them in a different light. However, those lines of research were not lost. Virtually, this is the foundation for the contemporary IC movements. And most importantly, the Journal of Human Resource Costing and Accounting was launched in 1996. So this is very, very, very important. And the journal is still around. Next slide, please. So the director of IC, Leif Edvinsson, as we all know, in 1995, Skandia published its first IC statements, and then we had a number of visionaries or pioneers, for example, Sweeby, St. Onge, Wieg, Leif, Tom Stewart. And in 1996, McMaster launched, Nick Bontis actually at McMaster University launched the World Congress on the Management of IC and Innovation. And I personally used to be in charge of one of the tracks at this conference for several years. Next slide, please. So the evolution, the KM and IC-centric journals. The first journal was launched in 1994, the Learning Organization. So this is when the academic side of IC first started. In 1997, JKM, and it's very interesting. I do communicate with Rory Chase, who is the editor-in-chief of JKM occasionally. And JKM was launched as a practitioner journal. It was not an academic outlet. No, that was a practitioner journal which got converted into an academic journal later on. So it happened in 1997. And if you see, approximately one new journal per year has been added to the entire bulk of journals in KM and IC. And I'll show you a list just in a few minutes. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the evolution, next slide shows you the KMIC relevant journals. Again, since 1970, this is when the first KMIC relevant journal appeared, and approximately at the rate of 1 new journal per year, the journals have been added. And it's also very interesting that the KMIC was initially driven by the industry practitioners, and those practitioners started publishing books. They started publishing academic articles, and eventually academics like myself joined the field. Next, please. So the historical progression of the discipline. This is from an unpublished manuscript that Nibontis and I just finished. It is under review. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the early concept. Those are the founding concepts of the disciplines. And then you'll see the 3 stages of the progression of KM and IC as a scientific discipline. The first, and it's very, very important in terms of the application of this model to your local research in KM in Brazil. So the first stage is what we call the value communication stage. This is when you simply need to communicate the value of the discipline and the concepts to a number of stakeholders to get their buy-in. And then eventually you have to move to the second stage, which is a theoretical consolidation stage. At the first value communication stage, the field simply borrows concepts. It doesn't give anything back to the practice and academia. It simply borrows ideas, borrows the concepts. When the field is at the theoretical consolidation stage, it is already given back some of the knowledge back. And ideally, at some point, the discipline is supposed to become what is called the reference discipline, when it returns more knowledge to the field of practice and academia than it borrows back. This is what would be called the normal science. Next slide, please. So this slide simply shows what a reference discipline is, and at some point we hope that KM and IC will become reference disciplines. You'll see that citations from the other disciplines simply go into the KM and IC disciplines, as well as the field of practice also refers to the discipline for its knowledge. Next, please. This is from a forthcoming paper. This is virtually the summary of an entire study which took us 3 years to do. It's forthcoming in JKM now. It shows the flow of citation to the KM field and out of the KM field. And the question is whether the KM field is a reference discipline. So I don't have time to simply go and explain it in detail, because I did a presentation a year ago just on this slide for half an hour. But if you just look at the very, very bottom in the bold font, you'll see that KM is not a reference discipline yet, because the KM topics in peer-reviewed journals citing KM articles represent 70%. So virtually, we borrow much more knowledge from the other disciplines than we give return knowledge back to the other domain. Next slide, please. So the IC discipline, this one also shows the flow of citation to the IC discipline and out of the IC discipline. And again, we concluded that IC is not a reference discipline. It simply borrows much more knowledge from the other domains than it returns back to the other disciplines. Next, please. The superstar effect. We have a paper published in the Journal of Informatics, where we investigated whether the superstar effect exists in the field of knowledge management. And the superstar effect simply appears if if few people, highly overproductive scholars, published most of the papers, or if few institutions in KM produce most of the research. And we did not observe the superstar effect in KM and IC disciplines, which means it is a healthy domain. At the same time, the role of practitioners has been declining. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay. Yes. Yeah, yeah. Is it? Yeah. Oh, good. Sorry, you lost me. So it is the same slide number 14. The role of practitioners, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the KM field was founded by the practitioners who later became academics. And if you just look at this graph, between 1994 and let's say and almost 2000, practitioners represented approximately 30% of all authors of the KM papers published in peer-reviewed journals. And you see that the number of practitioners has been gradually declining up to 10% in 2010. And personally, I believe that now maybe 5–6% of all papers are written by the practitioners. So it is becoming an academic field, a purely academic field. The good news is that that's a natural progression of the discipline. The bad news is that it's losing some of its practical touch and practical aspects. So it becomes more appealing to academics and less appealing to the practitioners. So this is the danger. And I'll talk about it later in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So the productivity slide, if you look at it, Brazil is number 26. Do you see it? Yes, this is a paper that we published in JKM a few years ago, where we looked at the productivity in terms of KM publications per country, and Brazil is number 26. I think it is not bad. At the same time, if you look at just the USA and the UK, just the volume, it is, I would say, slightly behind. So there is a long way to go. One of the goals to establish may be, let's say, to become one of top 15. Top 10, it may be just too hard. But top 15, this may be a very realistic goal. Next slide, please. This is the list of institutions in terms of their productivity. So if you're looking for people to collaborate or invite as a speaker, or if you are a student looking for a PhD program somewhere to go, this is the list of KM-oriented schools, places. Next, please. Now, this is a very important slide that I want to spend some time on. Those are the research methods used by the KM and IC researchers since 1994 until 2008. Especially, please pay attention to the last two columns, because it shows you the progression of the discipline, like a longitudinal change. So first of all, the first is the framework model approach tool development. Those are the theoretical papers, simply conceptual papers, and you'll see that the numbers are slightly declining from 34 to 30%, and now it is probably much, much lower. Case studies, and the case studies are one of the major methods used in KM and IC research. They slightly declined. Personally, I do not do case studies because Nick Bontis told me not to. He says it's very difficult to publish them. As a graduate student, I listened. The major advantage of case studies is that you're actually collaborating with the practitioners. You are going to the company. You're observing the real life phenomena. The bad news is that generalizability and the context is always a problem. So at some point, we have to slow down on case studies and look at the other methodology which are more acceptable in top-tier journals. literature reviews also went slightly down. However, the good news is that the surveys, which is a major empirical method, increased from 8 to 11%. The use of secondary data went up, and the use of interviews, which is number 6, it almost doubled. So those are the very, very good news. Simply shows you a regular developmental life cycle of a scientific discipline, where theoretical papers are slightly declining. At the same time, the empirical methods are going up, up, and up. Next, please. So this is the ranking of the KM journals. This is a forthcoming paper in the Journal of Knowledge Management. Actually, nobody in the world, except for a few reviewers and Rory Chase, have ever seen it. As some of you may probably know, Nick Bontis and I published a ranking of KM journals a few years ago. This is the updated version. Again, there have been some changes, but JKM and JIC came number 1 as A+ journals. At the same time, JIC slightly reduced its ranking. It is still number 2. However, it slightly decreased its performance. And then you see the learning organization. Knowledge management research in practice. I personally believe in our next ranking, it is going to be number 2. I don't have any research bias, but based on what we saw in the data. And the major reason is that it is not currently indexed by Thomson Reuters. So only 2 journals are indexed, JKM and KMRP. And in some schools, for example, in my schools, you are rewarded much more for publishing in journals which are indexed. So JKM and KMRP are now, I believe, experiencing much more submissions. So this is the list of those 25 journals. And another thing I want to add is that I think we have way too many. The field is not that big. There are not so many researchers. And every year a new journal is launched. And when I looked at some of them, like Nick Bontis and I, we just looked, it's like, come on, well, the impact of this journal is like below the impact of just a junior faculty member in North America. If the age index of a journal which has been around for 10 years is only 5 or 6, like I don't see any impact of this outlet on the state of theory in practice. So please don't try to launch any new journals in Brazil unless it is published in your own language. In your own language, I would welcome it. In English, probably not. Instead, spend time and resources on publishing good quality papers and good quality journals. It will create a much better impact on the state of theory and practice. Next slide, please. And those are the journals which are KM and IC relevant. I believe there are 23 of them that we found. Some of them are borderline between KM and IC centric and relevant, so it is arguable. Some people are already critiqued us for including or not including some of the journals, but the problem is you cannot please everybody creating those rankings. But this is simply a list of journals. So if you have a graduate student, just give this person both lists and make sure they'll go to those journals and look for papers, hopefully high quality papers in those journals. Next slide, please. The next topic I'm going to talk about is the relevance of knowledge management research. So Nick Bontis and I, we spent over $100,000 of a government grant studying this issue, and we published a number of papers on this topic. And the issue is very simple. We researchers create knowledge which is published in peer-reviewed journals. This is what we do. Practitioners, of course, they do need this knowledge published in the journals. However, the peer-reviewed publications are not suitable for the consumption by the busy practitioners. Next slide, please. This is the model that we created through a number of interviews of KM practitioners. And if you just look at the academic publication, this huge rectangle right in the middle, you'll see that the intended audience is simply academics. It's not the practitioners. The level of abstraction is way too high. Practitioners do have a problem with the way our papers are written, the use of language, words, complicated formulas. Unless you have a PhD and you are specializing in quantitative methods, there is no way can you possibly get through a complicated PLS section of our paper. It is just not written for you. However, it is also a problem because this knowledge is lost. And what we believe is that there should be a knowledge market. We call them knowledge markets. And those markets simply, it's on the right-hand side in the middle of the model. It's called knowledge market. And the role of knowledge market is simply to take the converted version of academic articles and summarize them, put them into the format which is suitable for busy industry professionals to make sure this knowledge is not going to be lost. And for example, conferences for practitioners, books, textbooks, because books and textbooks simply summarize thousands of articles as well as personal experience of the author, consultants, etc., professional journals. Next slide, please. And finally, how to promote KM and IC research in Brazil. So again, the first phase, I would call it, is the value communication stage. You need to articulate the advantages of KM and IC to the major stakeholders, as well as potential stakeholders. Government would be number one, I would say, simply because they have way too much knowledge and they don't use it to their best advantage. The military. That's an excellent. It's not only the consumer of your research; it's also one of the probably exemplars of knowledge management. I believe that the U.S. Army or U.S. Navy was awarded the best public organization in terms of knowledge management maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So the military, you can simply go there and use examples, see how it works and how they do manage knowledge. And one of the reasons they do manage knowledge is that simply the lowest line employees, so that the soldiers, they want to share their knowledge with their colleagues because another soldier may save your life tomorrow. The universities, colleges, granting agencies, I would emphasize the role of granting agencies as a major stakeholder because researchers do need money. You do need money to pay your graduate students, to collect data, to analyze data, to hire research associates. So the granting agencies, I would say that's one of the major stakeholders, and they do need to understand the value of KMIC. Private public organizations, my personal finding is that try to concentrate on the savings side. It's very easy to simply demonstrate how much money will be saved for your organization or for a government department by simply removing work duplication. And another thing, please do report measurable impact. That's very important. That it's not like you're just launching a KM initiative. You need to figure out how you're going to measure the impact and communicate this impact back to the key stakeholders. Otherwise, well, it's very, very difficult to demonstrate the impact. Next slide, please. And the second stage would be the theoretical consolidation phase or stage when you need to establish presence at the international research arena. Again, please don't try to establish new journals. Conferences, I would welcome conferences, as well as please try to attend as many conferences outside of your country as possible. Create research teams, and please emphasize quality over quantity. You cannot imagine, but I know that JKM gets probably the acceptance rate is 10% or lower, and most of the papers they get is that when a graduate student or somebody looked at two different papers of with KM frameworks and decided to create his or her own framework based on those two papers by adding a few squares in a few boxes. So please don't try to create new theoretical frameworks, don't create new tools, don't create new models. There are way too many of them already created. Instead, use empirical methods to test those models, to test those theoretical frameworks. There is no need for new theoretical knowledge in the field. Try to apply empirical methods to advance the science. And please concentrate on the rigorous methodology. and focus on international journals. And as I already mentioned, the Journal of Knowledge Management and Knowledge Management Research in Practice are currently indexed by Thomson, or formerly ISI, Social Sciences Citation Impact Index. When the school administrations hear those words, they just love it, because this is what granting agencies are looking for. Next slide, please. Another good way to get into top-tier journals with KM papers is to use underrepresented methods. For example, focus groups or lab experiments or field experiments. Those are dramatically underrepresented in all journals. So I'm sure the editors will be happy to see a field experiment launched in Brazil to test an existing framework in your local culture, in your local context. This is what the reviewers and the editors, at least personally me, would be looking for. And please always think about the impact, both theoretical and practical impact of each study. Next. And the translation mechanisms, the practical impact of your academic research. Practitioner journals, magazines, those are a must for a field to succeed, and those should be created and written, published in your own language, in Portuguese, not in English, because you want an average manager to be able to read an article written, especially, it's like great comprehension level in normal, simple language without any statistical formulas, simply a prescript article, what in a specific context, in a specific situation. Professional associations, for example, a couple of years ago, we did a study of a professional association. Those were the members of Chartered Business Valuation Association. Those are the people that simply go to the businesses and they say how much this business is worth if you want to, let's say, buy it or sell it. And those do use lots and lots of academic journals, and their professional association is a major source of this knowledge. So try to establish contacts with the professional associations. Their needs in terms of KM would be email news groups, newspapers, research highlights. Now many journals do it, but when you're submitting an article, you're also creating a research highlight with just, I believe it's like 100 words. It is not an abstract. It's only in form where you said what you did and what you found. And it's written in a normal, plain language, which probably anybody who can read the language can understand. Knowledge transfer professional. That's virtually a new profession now in North America, or knowledge brokers. Those are the people that translate academic findings for busy practitioners into their own language. Books and textbooks, as well as maybe it's a good idea to translate the seminal books into your own language. And finally, this is the last slide. Develop research centers and graduate programs in KM and IC. And I think the best way is to concentrate on the research methods and simply try to invite adjunct faculty members from Europe, North America, who have expertise in research methods. Not only the business gurus, no, those people who I would call methodologists. They have very good understanding of, let's say, qualitative research design. Those people who may actually educate your students, as well as, let's say, quantitative, somebody who specializes in PLS, who may teach a brief workshop on PLS for your graduate student. So try to use the adjunct faculty. Well, I do understand it does cost money, but sometimes people may do a workshop just because somebody with a family just wants to fly to Brazil for vacation for a week. So I'm sure if you keep searching, you'll find such people. So that's all for today. And I'll be very, very happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Logo na parte da manhã, duas conferências internacionais, uma com o Lakehead Vinson, que é um dos fundadores desse movimento do Capital Intelectual, e outra com um professor alemão indicado pelo Lakehead Vinson para falar também de métricas de mensuração do Gestão do Conhecimento e Capital Intelectual e Intangíveis. Então, a partir de 8h30 nós vamos estar aqui amanhã. A abertura da conferência, da videoconferência, é às 9 horas. Então, pediria a vocês para estarem aqui, se possível, nesse horário. Tá bom? Gente, muito obrigado pela presença hoje. Amanhã a gente se vê.